Howdy folks, we're looking at the final chapter of the Sega Genesis saga. This time looking at the years 1995 to 1998. The Genesis was still competing with the Super Nintendo back then, but new consoles were arriving, new technology had to be pushed. Sega was doing all kinds of weird things that didn't help their company, and it was Genesis who, on one hand, Sega tried to make it still important, but on the other hand, it ended up cutting its lifespan shorter. We'll talk a little bit about more of that later. Also, when it comes to the Super Nintendo and other consoles like the PlayStation. So, what was it like back in 1995 to own a Genesis or consider owning one? Well, before I get into that, I still want to take a quick look at what was done before. I have a list here. You can see here, I chose all the games I think that that could have been an interest of you if you wanted to get a Genesis or had one at the beginning of 1995. And you can see there are a lot of titles to choose from. The more explanation points, the more important I think the game was, with Sonic 2 being really the only must-have game. So the Super Nintendo also had a lot of titles, actually just the same amount, also 33 or 43, I don't remember how many I counted, but plenty of games to choose from. At this moment in time, early 95, the Super Nintendo had more must-have titles, so not only a platformer like Mario, but also Zelda 3 and Super Mario Kart, Super Metroid, and Donkey Kong Country. So I would say that at the beginning of 95, the Super Nintendo was doing better than the Genesis. And how that further developed we'll be looking into in this video. So let's put away this list for now and open up our trusty Internet Explorer. So I think in February 95 we had NBA Jam Tournament Edition, which was a slight improvement of the original. Not much more to say about that, so just showing you that more third-party titles were still being made for the Genesis, because it was, at the time, still the best sold 16-bit computer for the American regions. I think by now Europe was 50-50, and Japan, well, they were much more into the Nintendo. Now, Phantasy Star 4, in my opinion, was the first Phantasy Star game that could truly compete with a Final Fantasy title. Now, this was released in early 95 in the Americas, while it was actually originally released in late 93 in Japan. It's not a very, there's not a lot to it. It has a rather simple story, but it's a very quick RPG. You don't get lost. The graphics and sound are superb. It's just a really nice RPG to go through. I don't think it has that much replay value, though. Compared to the story of Final Fantasy VI, it's not very good. It's more, I would even say Final Fantasy IV is a better story. But compared to those in maybe Dragon Quest VI, about that level, Genesis fanboys love this game because it's the best RPG, and they always say, like, well, look, we had all RPGs too. But I don't think it's as good as the best ones on the Super Nintendo. But still definitely worth noting, and I enjoyed playing it. Rise Star. So another great platforming game made for the Genesis by Sega. So very colorful and nice. One of the best games, actually. Now, we briefly discussed Landstalker in a previous video. This is more like their answer to Secret of Mana. It's very arcade-like. Beyond Oasis, called The Story of Thor in other regions. And it's kind of like an arcade beat-em-up RPG, top-down. So here, good action RPG for the Genesis. So when it comes to RPGs, the Genesis were getting better by 1995. Now Road Rash had a third title, this time with interesting-looking graphics based on photographs, I think. Yeah, it sold well, so I put it here. Now, Theme Park, you could build your own theme park, kind of like SimCity. Based on the Amiga game. This was indeed released for the Americas, even though it was mostly popular in Europe. And Was there a Super Nintendo version? I think there was actually, but I put it in the Genesis list because of having high enough grades. Hey, Phantom 2040, kind of like a Metroidvania. Hidden gem. Now rediscover thanks to internet culture. The Super Nintendo version is slightly better, but still good enough for the Genesis. Now, Alien Soldier was never released in the United States as a cartridge, but it was on the Sega channel, so I still put it in here. So in the summer 1995, you could play that. It's chock full of awesome bosses made by Treasure, and it's now a classic because there's never been another game like this. It's really cool to try it out. Now, Comic Zone was another kind of hidden gem. I don't know. When I was a kid, this was a fairly popular game, so I don't know why people are acting like they're rediscovering it. I never considered it very interesting. It had fantastic visuals. I mean, you play in a comic book, so that's cool. But when it came to gameplay, I didn't find it very interesting. But still, a lot of people tend to like it now. So, World Series Baseball 95, I included in this list because it was apparently quite an improvement above the earlier one. There was also Triple Play Baseball for the Genesis made by Electronic Arts. So all of a sudden, there were really good baseball games for the Genesis in 1995. And Mortal Kombat 3 being released in the autumn. By now, Mortal Kombat was losing a little bit of its appeal. Still a very big title. But the PlayStation 1 version was better. I think that took out some of the stole some of this game's thunder. The Super Nintendo version looked and sounded better. Okay, Vector Man. Using 3D graphics converged to 2D sprites, kind of like Donkey Kong Country. It's a run and gun shoot 'em up. Looks pretty cool. So that was released for the Genesis late in its career. The Genesis version of Wrestlemania, the arcade game, was better than the Super Nintendo version. And it was quite a popular game. Pretty cool arcade game, and successfully transferred to the Genesis. Earthworm Jim 2 was more zany Earthworm Jim Adventures, this time for the Genesis. Interestingly enough, the Super Nintendo version is slightly better. But this would become one of the last hurrahs of the Genesis. And one last game released in... No, so almost there. FIFA 96, apparently a good improvement of, compared to earlier FIFA games, so that was there, selling well. Super Tecmo Bowl 3. Well, there were a lot of Tecmo Bowl games. In the long run, this is the one people are still playing. Along with, although the Super Nintendo version seems to be more popular on the internet, so people are either playing the NES version of the NES version of Tecmo Super Bowl or Super Bowl 3 for the Super Nintendo. But it was also for the Genesis, so if you wanted action-packed arcade-like football for the Genesis, you can get that too. Toy Story was a very good-looking, but not very impressive platformer game for the Genesis. Many people consider it to be better than the Super Nintendo version because it has a couple extra things. Sold really well, of course. Now, that was 1995, and it was the last year that the Genesis kept releasing good games. In 1996, there weren't that many good games anymore. I want to mention Sonic 3D Blast, which was the disappointing 3D version of Sonic. It was also released for the Saturn. The isometric view just did not work very well for the poor fellow. And it really showed that Sonic could only work in 2D. I don't even know if it sold well, but there was some hype for it because this was going to be the last game made by Sega for the Genesis, and it was, supposed to be something. But I don't know, people felt rather mixed about it. And then finally, there's Vector Man 2, also released in late 1996. More run and jumping action and shooting, of course. And that were all the Sega Genesis games worth getting. So now we're already in late 1996. How do people feel by then? Well, in 1995, we had the 32-bit consoles, the Saturn and the PlayStation 1. And that took all the hype. I mean, the Genesis was always geared towards people who wanted to have a more sensational, technologically driven attitude towards games. They tried to keep the Genesis of interest using the Sega CD, which might have flopped, but it did have the advantage of people thinking, well, okay, well, you can get a Super Nintendo, but at least the Genesis has a CD add-on, which some people thought it made it stronger than the Super Nintendo, which wasn't the case. But there was also the 32X released in late '94 with 32-bit games, which weren't that impressive, to be honest. So the Genesis, Sega always tried to push for the newest of the newest, which was smart because the Super Nintendo and basically Nintendo, they were also always more focused on the games itself. So the technology always came to second place, and I think that's also why most of the games made by Nintendo have withstood the test of time. While most Sega games are more of curiosities. They're still fun to play in short bursts, but they don't have that lasting appeal. With the Saturn, which was going to be the newest, Sega made a lot of mistakes, as we all know. They didn't consider 3D polygon-driven graphics until too late, because the PlayStation was able to do that. So it was $100 more expensive than the PlayStation in 1995, and the games weren't that much better. What this meant for the Genesis was Sega was putting all their effort into the Saturn, and not that much left anymore for the Genesis. They tried to have some overlap between the 32X and the Saturn with games like Virtual Racing and Virtual Fighter, but that didn't really work out because the technology was so different. And there was also some fighting in between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. I think Sega of Japan was a bit disappointed with how arrogant the Sega of America was acting. So, from what I understood, there were actually, when it came to the Dreamcast or something, Sega of America had certain ideas how to make it, and Sega of Japan was like, nope, not going to have that. And they just threw all the ideas of the Americas off the board just to show off their dominance. Now, what happened to the Super Nintendo at the time? Because in '95, most people didn't want to have the 32-bit systems yet because they were too expensive. It didn't have enough good games. So if you were 1995 and considering getting a system, well, the Super Nintendo kept getting excellent games. I already have, let's see, here they are from '95. We had Mega Man X2, NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Bust a Move was like a Tetris game. Kirby's Avalanche, also like a Tetris game. Most people know it as Puyo Pop. Oh, did I add Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine? Maybe that was, I think that was released in 1993, 94. That was released earlier, but this was the Super Nintendo's answer to that. Metal Warriors, another run and gun and shoot platformer game. Now, Super Adventure Island 2 was actually kind of like a Metroidvania in the Super Adventure style. Ogre Battle. Now, finally, the American Super Nintendo owners had a strategy game to call themselves. The Genesis was better at the time with War Song and Shining Force, but now the Super Nintendo had Ogre Battle. International Superstar Soccer is considered by many the best football soccer game for the 16-bit consoles. Hagani, a really awesome ninja game. Civilization, another strategy game, a bit larger scale than most war games, was released for the Super Nintendo and worked very well. Theme Park, here it is for the Super Nintendo. Now, Earthbound is now the cult classic. You all know about it, at least in mid-'95 in the Americas. Wild Guns, like an arcade shooter. Now, Killer Instinct got a lot of hype at the time, but by the time it was released in late '95, not that many people were that interested in fighting games anymore, and it sold well, but not as well as Nintendo had hoped. It also didn't look that great. It was based on the arcade game, which people were hoping to have released for the Nintendo 64 by late '95. Nintendo 64 would take another year to come out, so they released it for the Super Nintendo, and it looked kind of grainy. It sounded excellent. It played really well. It played better than the arcade, actually. But it didn't have the awesome visuals. So it was a bit of a disappointment. I'm still giving that exclamation point because it did sell well. Yoshi's Island, fantastic platforming game, still a classic. Now, Chrono Trigger, oops, Chrono Trigger, yeah, one of the best RPGs ever made in '95. 3 exclamation points, because I think that made a bigger impression on people than Final Fantasy VI at the time. Now, Doom was released, only got a 53 on average, so, but in my experience, it was pretty cool to actually play the hottest game for PCs on the Super Nintendo. Now, Mortal Kombat 3 was great. Secret of Evermore, one of my favorite games, a very quirky RPG. Will it ever become as popular as Earthbound? I don't think so, but it's in my heart. Tekken Super Bowl 3, like I said, released for the Super Nintendo, still being played. Super Turrican 2, running gun action. Earthworm Jim 2, yeah. ISS Deluxe, so International Superstar Soccer got a sequel in the same year for the Americas, and it was slight improvements. That's still being played by some people. And Donkey Kong Country 2, more great Donkey Kong country action, this time much better level design. And Breath of Fire 2, another great RPG for the Super Nintendo, released in '95. So RPGs really broke through for the Super Nintendo late in its era. But it didn't end there. '96 also had a bunch of good games. Super Mario RPG, Lufia 2, again RPGs. Tetris Attack was considered by Electronic Gaming Monthly the best game of 1996, and actually they're right. The 32-bit consoles didn't have that many good games in '96, and Tetris Attack is one of the best puzzle games ever made. It's some people call it Panel de Pon. Try it out. It's really good. Kirby Superstar was a bunch of different Kirby games put together. A lot of fun. Molly Mallard and Cold Shout. Did they release this? I don't think they released it for the Genesis. Well, they should have. Let me look that up. Pretty good action adventure Disney title with what's his name? Daffy Duck? No, Donald Duck. Okay. Hey, Street Fighter Alpha 2 was magically transported to the Super Nintendo. I had it at home. Yeah, it's a lot like the arcade game. It actually works. The sprites are a bit smaller, but other than that, it's pretty close to the arcade. And Donkey Country 3, more levels in Donkey Country style. Some people complain the levels are a little bit too difficult and a bit weird. Well, what do you expect after 2 other games? But still worth looking into if you love those games. But '97, there were even more games for the Super Nintendo. Lost Vikings 2, consider just more levels of Lost Vikings action. Also released for the Saturn and PlayStation, if I recall correctly, but also for the Super Nintendo. Harvest Moon became a cult classic, the farming simulator. And way at the end, late '97, the Super Nintendo still had Kirby's Dream Land 3, an excellent platformer game. So, I didn't get a PlayStation until I think mid '97 actually. Yeah, because I didn't find enough good games for the PlayStation or Saturn that I wanted to spend hundreds of dollars on. And I was playing my Super Nintendo and Genesis with a lot of fun at the time. I didn't feel like I was missing out much. I still went to arcades for the fighting games. If I didn't have an arcade, I probably would have wanted to get a Saturn for fighting games. I was really into those back then. But and I made a list of the PlayStation games released in early '10. Like '95, you had Ridge Racer and Tekken for the PlayStation 1. Those were the 2 standout titles. Twisted Metal and Destruction Derby also sold pretty well. But an average gamer like me, I wasn't that impressed. Wipeout was very popular with the mainstream in England. That's why it also gets an exclamation point. I didn't like these games that much. And but speaking of other people really got into the PlayStation brand because it had fantastic marketing. It targeted itself at people about 25 years old. People go clubbing, people who drink, people who watch foreign movies. So they targeted the system at cool people, and they did that with success. And the games did look cool. They were all 3D, lots of color, CD sound. They're a bit weird, but not too weird. So the PlayStation was able to do very well for the mainstream. And at the same time, you had the Saturn, of course, which, like I said, it was more expensive, and Daytona USA didn't look as good as Ridge Racer, and Virtua Fighter 1 didn't look as good as Tekken. So a lot of people felt like, okay, would you pay more money for a less good system? By the end of '95, they released Virtua Fighter 2, Excellent fighting game. Looked really good too. Almost arcade perfect. And they released Sega Rally. And I thought at the time, like, okay, so Sega now proved that they had a better system because they also released Virtual Cop, World Series Baseball, and a couple other good games, right? So to me, they actually had a better year, 1995, thanks to these two titles. And I thought, okay, well, Saturn's going to have a chance. Well, in 96, well, the Saturn kept focusing on kind of, I don't know, Japanese-like games, a lot of fighting games. And like they had Wipeout, which was popular in England, but hardly anybody knew that it was released for the Saturn. Panzer Dragoon games were considered very popular with hardcore gamers, but only hardcore gamers. It was a bit too weird for the mainstream. So while the hardcore gamers, they got into Saturn because of the fighting games, because it had other quirky titles. I'm looking kind of looking for them. I only see like I don't know, Sega Worldwide Soccer. They actually have pretty good 3D shooters like Power Slave, and Tomb Raider was also released for the Saturn. A lot of people forget that, but mostly it was the marketing. The PlayStation was able to sell itself as the cool system, and the Saturn was more like the system for gamers, which meant that it didn't sell as well. The big title which I think made a big difference was the Resident Evil game released in early 96. That came later for the Saturn, I think like a year later. But that was like the first game that I, as a gamer, thought, okay, that's something I want to play because it was not only unique, it was a bit longer than the average arcade game. And later Crash Bandicoot came out, which wasn't as weird as Nights into Dreams. Tekken 2 came out, and again, great marketing. So by late 97, it was clear that the PlayStation was doing better. And because the PlayStation was doing so well, the Genesis owners, they jumped ship. Either to the Saturn, if you were a dedicated Sega owner, or you got a PlayStation, because you were now probably evolving from a teenager who liked games into a grown-up who still liked games, but was only interested in the most spectacular of them. So, yeah, that pretty much wraps up the history of what it was like for the Genesis to compete with other systems and games at the time. I want to show you just one more list. It's here on this website, Eurogamer.net. I once did a lot of research on which system, the Super Nintendo Genesis, was actually better objectively. This list doesn't take timelines too much into account. But I want to just make one thing clear, is that it was really close. Like, I put all these platform games on a long list, and I came to the conclusion that both of them had the same amount of quality when it came to platforming games. When it came to shooters, everybody says that the Genesis was better, and I would definitely agree for the first 2 years. But eventually, the Super Nintendo had Space Megaforce, R-Type 3, UN Squadron. If you imported, you had Scrambled Valkyrie, which was also very good. So, plenty of good shooters for the Super Nintendo, unless you were really hardcore. And games like, what do you call it, Star Fox and Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, they gave you some experiences that the Genesis didn't have. So I think it was really close. Beat 'em ups, also a Genesis thing, mostly due to Streets of Rage being better than Final Fight. But after that, I'd say it was actually pretty close. I mean, you have Comic Zone and Batman Returns, both based on comic books. Crude Buster and Double Dragon 4, maybe not the most popular, but even for those who wanted to get all the beat-em-ups, you could find plenty on both systems. Fighting games was a Super Nintendo thing. Well, again, not that big of a difference. I mean, you had the joypads were a thing, of course. But you had Street Fighter 2, so you could get your own unique fighting game a year before Eternal Champions was released. But which other fighting games did you play? Well, there weren't that many other interesting ones. I mean, Tournament Fighter was great, and Samurai Showdown was really good on the Genesis. Were they popular? No, not that. Mortal Kombat was a thing. Well, like I put in this list, Mortal Kombat 1 was all the hype because it had blood. Mortal Kombat 2, which was released a year later, simply was a better game. Not only compared to Mortal Kombat 1, but also compared to the Genesis version. And an underground cult title is Yu Yu Hakusho for the Genesis. Well, I compared that to Killer Instinct. Sports titles, another thing that Genesis owners like to boast about. Yes, NHLPA 93 was better on the Genesis. Yes, Madden was better on the Genesis. Later on, though, the NBA Live Series was better on the Super Nintendo. That didn't even things out, though. But you had good baseball games on the Super Nintendo. You had International Superstar Soccer later on in '95 for the Super Nintendo. So in the long run, things evened out. Super Punch-Out, I don't know, it doesn't really feel like a sports title, but it was definitely better than any boxing game on the Genesis. Racing games, well, that to me, thanks to the FX chip, and the what do you call it? No, not the FX chip, the Mode 7 capabilities, simply had better racing games. Mario Kart and F-Zero are the best, so I'll check those out. Now, adventure games. Let's see what we have here. Well, Wonder Boy, Landstalker are the closest things the Genesis had compared to Zelda and Super Metroid. Like I said, Beyond Oasis is kind of like Secret of Mana. And then a bunch of other adventure games. All quality, the ones listed here. So you had plenty to choose on both systems. The Super Nintendo had a couple of them that stuck out. Tactics. If you had import, you could get Famicom Wars and Fire Emblem, and that would even things out. Bahamut Lagoon. For this list, I considered import to be fair game. But if you only were in the Americas, I would actually say the Genesis had a better streak. Now, role-playing, it's no contest. I mean, you had a couple good ones like Shine in the Darkness. And this isn't I don't agree with this anymore. They're both good in their own ways. Starfight was actually a hidden gem for the Genesis. And some people include Lunar for the Sega CD on this list because apparently it's very good, but whatever. Even then, if you're into role-playing games, the Super Nintendo easily won. Other funny games, I would have played this one with Devil's Crush now, but yeah, when it came to other kind of games, like Tetris Attack was definitely better than Columns. Mario Paint was more interesting than Wacky Worlds. But considering the times, how much money would you want if you wanted to get a new system? You're going to pay a couple $100s, and before you made the decision, you had to get attracted by the best of the best games, and that's something that the Super Nintendo won more often than the Genesis. The Genesis had Sonic and Streets of Rage; those stuck out for the more mainstream people. Nintendo, however, had Mario, had Donkey Kong, had Street Fighter, had Mario Kart. And did I mention Zelda? So Super had more games that really attracted people if they wanted to play games. Of course, the Genesis was always a bit cheaper, so I think that evened out the price, especially in Europe. But I think, as I say here, if you're interested in a console with games that are still awesome to play this day, the SNES has twice the classic power. So even for today, I would consider it to be the winner. But I would like to emphasize that I think both consoles are great. You should have tried to get both back then. And I don't consider myself to be a Nintendo fanboy because I've always considered the Genesis looked better. I always loved the commercials, especially the ones that ended with Sega. That always cracks me up. Yeah, I love Sega Genesis too. I've beaten lots of games for it. And I always look forward to getting a Genesis title in my Nintendo Switch library. So, yeah. I hope you learned a lot looking at this video, what it was like to get into the Genesis back then. After this, I'd like to look into the Saturn, how good that was. I think it's underrated compared to the PlayStation. But it was really expensive. I would have said, I only had a PlayStation 1 at the time. I had a friend who had a Saturn. If I had all the money in the world, I think I would have gotten both. And that's what I'm going to try to make clear in my next video. But I'm also considering looking at the Master System games, which are also underrated. But that's for another time. Thanks for listening. Check out my other videos if you like. And see you around.